Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final lecture of the semester. It has been a long, strange trip, but we have arrived and we have made it through the entirety of the curriculum. There were many moments I did not think that was going to be possible, but we made it work. So I appreciate your patience throughout this entire semester, and boy, just a strange time, but we made it work. Today, we are going to be wrapping up our 1920s unit, and again, we're going to be taking a look at some of the changing norms in society with specific focus on women's roles and how those begin to change and how women become more independent in the 1920s. We're also going to look at how the youth have changed kind of their focus. Of course, they were the ones that actually fought World War I, and when they returned from that war, they have a much different look on life. We'll also take a look at the Harlem Renaissance. We'll see what's happening in some minority communities and how that has led to a revival in America of brand new music, and that really sweeps the country, kind of the jazz age, if you will. And then we'll finally take a look at a list of just some, not only celebrities, but also some national heroes emerge. Not that those two terms should be used interchangeably. Those are two very different things. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Get your notes out, and let's go ahead and get rolling. So we're going to start out by talking about the changing roles of women. And in particular, part of what has changed is very visible. And that is women have adopted a much more independent style of dress. Now, granted, not everyone. Of course, this was mainly among the younger generations of women, but we have the so-called flapper girls, a Halloween costume favorite for women. But you just think about all the pictures you've seen of women before this time, and just think about how drastically different the style of dress is, the hairstyle. You know, women are cutting their hair short, and women had never done that before, not in our society at least. You know, you have, the dress style, just everything has started changing, and it represents kind of this new wave of American thought among women. And I think a lot of this does have to do with getting the right to vote. I mean, when people don't have a voice in their system of government, they don't have representation, that affects how they act. And I think there is this feeling of independence as they gain more political clout, and I think that does affect, frankly, how they live their lives. Now, even though women are becoming more independent, there is what we call a double standard that is increasing. So, society is saying, sure, you can do these things, but often in reality and practice, when women were going into the workplace, they were finding that often they were paid less than men, that they could not have certain jobs. They were not selected as top, CEOs of companies. And so on one hand, society is saying, sure, be independent, do what you want. But on the other hand, they're saying, but you can't do this. So there is kind of a double standard that increases during that time. But the numbers are increasing. About 10 million women are working at this time. And in each case, most cases, they're earning less than their male counterparts. So, and that is something that sadly has not changed as much. There's been some progress, but that is still an issue even to this day. I mentioned the youth in my introduction, and again, World War I has just ended a few years back, and especially for the young men that went off to fight, the young women that often serves as nurses overseas. I mean, the horrors that they saw. They came back to America, and they realized life is short, and frankly, they were going to enjoy it. So this old quote, this quote here: "We've been forced to live in an atmosphere of tomorrow we die, so naturally we drink and are merry." So they're questioning some of these traditional thought processes on what people should be doing and how they should be living their lives. And so we're seeing some different trends emerge, and frankly, young people are behind a lot of these trends. So different fads of the 1920s, just kind of threw this in there, kind of fun. But you do see the emergence of dance marathons across the country, and today they seem kind of silly. But basically you would have these contests where couples would stay out on the dance floor, and the last one standing was the winner, and often winning a prize or whatnot. Now, music is becoming a much bigger part of everyone's life at this time. And as I alluded to in the last lecture, part of that is due to the rising influence of radio. In the 1920s, we saw kind of the birth of radio. By 1930, though, 40% of households are going to have a radio. And so you think about, that transition over 10 years that basically half the households in the country have this one medium of communication and technology. That's pretty rapid. Now, when we later compare that to things like television or even the internet, we'll see that that's actually quite low. But you have to understand how remarkable that was for the time period. Radio is going to begin dominating how people spend time in their home. They have entertainment shows on, they have news, they have sports. So, this is becoming kind of the new norm for American society, and it's being born right here in the 1920s. Now, as I said, celebrities I probably shouldn't necessarily put heroes on here. I'm sure some of these people were heroes to some, but celebrities of the 1920s. Babe Ruth, one of the most famous baseball players of all time, the great Bambino. Shout out to The Sandlot, one of my favorite movies. In 1927, Babe Ruth would hit 60 home runs, and that was a record that would last for a very long time, for decades. And again, the impact of the radio, people actually could listen in on Yankees games, and they could hear Babe Ruth going for this record. And so again, kind of it created more unity across the country just through that medium of radio. Baseball is an interesting topic during this period, and I want to remind you that in baseball, and frankly in every other area of society, America is a segregated nation at this time, and frankly, white and black people are in some cases unable to get together legally speaking. And baseball is a great example of this. So we talk about the major leagues and having the best ball players, but that's actually not necessarily true, because in the 1920s, being a segregated industry, black people were not allowed to play in the major leagues. And what that meant was, frankly, some of the best stars, some of the best baseball players in the world were unable to play in the majors. And so they formed their own league. And perhaps we're more familiar with this being from Kansas City, given the fact we had the Monarchs here, and the Kansas City is home to the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. But the Negro Leagues, is one of these examples of not only how impressive some of these athletes were, but also on the flip side of that coin, kind of the sad realization that they were not being provided with equal, opportunities. And some of the best baseball players in the world were kept out of the majors just simply because of their skin color. I put up here a couple. Satchel Paige, one of my favorite baseball players. An interesting note about Satchel Paige, who's pictured in the upper right-hand corner there. He was born and raised in Kansas City. His family was extremely poor. In fact, he didn't even have a birth certificate when he was born, and so he actually never knew how old he was. That meant that he just kept playing baseball. Most baseball players, by the time they hit 40, they're retiring. I mean, that's pretty old for a baseball player. Since Satchel Paige didn't know how old he was, he just kept playing. And I've seen some historians estimate he was playing into his upper 40s just because he could still pitch and enjoyed the game. But he was born here, and he also died here. He's buried in Kansas City as well. But one of the best pitchers that the world has ever seen. And of course, Kansas City would also be home to Jackie Robinson, who played for the Kansas City Monarchs at one point. Jackie Robinson would make world history by joining the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947, becoming the first African American to cross that color line and to join the major leagues. So just a reminder that, I feel like in this unit in particular, we're talking about a lot of progress, but we are way behind in other areas, and this is still a very racially divided country at this time, and we need to remember that, again, to understand our story on how we got to where we are today. Some other national celebrities at this time. Charles Lindbergh was a pilot. He was the first one to fly a plane nonstop across the Atlantic. I'm going to talk more about Charles Lindbergh later on. He was most notable for this brave act of flying across the Atlantic, and was really kind of seen as a hero both here and in Europe, where he landed. Lindbergh would go on to become this celebrity, and frankly would have a much more politicized voice in the 1930s, and frankly did not use that as well as could have liked. We're going to see Lindbergh become the voice of the America First movement in the 1930s, which tried to keep the United States out of World War II. And even though the motivations might have been fine for most people, Lindbergh wasn't. He had a lot of anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish rhetoric, and I want to make sure that we're well aware of that. So, yes, a brave act of crossing the Atlantic in a plane solo, but definitely had a number of faults, and another reminder that racism is extremely prevalent in this society. And again, I think we've made some progress there, but we have a long ways to go. Also, the first movie star began with silent movies, but Charlie Chaplin will become really the world's first movie star, and spends a career long enough that he will actually survive into the talkie films, where they begin actually having sound associated with those. But the 1920s is where he gets his start. George Gershwin, if you're involved in musicals at school, odds are you've probably done a Gershwin musical at some point, but he was a very popular composer that was responsible for many Broadway hits in the 1920s. Georgia O'Keeffe was an artist. Her scenes of the Southwest, very warm colors, very famous in the 1920s. F. Scott Fitzgerald, odds are perhaps in one of your advanced English classes, you probably read maybe The Great Gatsby. I know I did when I was in high school. He is the one that coined this term, the Jazz Age, which I think I used at the very beginning of this lecture, but that is another reference to the 1920s, where jazz explodes on the scene, and we're about to talk about that in the Harlem Renaissance. Finally, Ernest Hemingway, who was an author, another Kansas City connect. Kansas City, man, 1920s might have been one of the high points for Kansas City, because a lot of, it was on the map at that time. But Ernest Hemingway was a reporter in Kansas City at that time. Later on would become, of course, a very, very famous author. But he actually went over to the battlefields in Europe during World War I and was frankly horrified by what he saw, and wrote a lot about how Americans tend to romanticize war, and how we don't like to talk about the violence of war, or the what happens after war, where you have a number of young men, 18-year-old kids that are coming home that have lost both legs, and they're going to be like that the rest of their life. We have a tendency to glorify war and romanticize it, instead of actually trying to digest all of the horrors that come with it. So Ernest Hemingway was well known for that. So our final look of the semester, we're going to take a look at what is happening among African American populations in the United States. And in the 1920s, we have a pretty remarkable transition movement throughout this country of African Americans. Keep in mind, the Civil War has now been over for about 50 years, and most recently freed slaves in the days following the Civil War and into Reconstruction, of course, most of them were extremely poor. They didn't have money, and frankly, it does take money to get up and move. I always have students every year, well, if it was so bad in the South, why didn't they just move? Well, how do you do that? I guess you just start walking, but how are you going to feed yourself along the way unless you have money? There's a lot of logistical changes that you may not have thought of. It's not just as simple as picking up and moving out. But by the 1920s, there have been some major changes that have allowed African Americans to leave the South in masse. And part of it is frankly out of fear. I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, the beginning of this unit, the revival of the KKK, and this Klan was much more violent than what we had seen before. And the South is continuing to terrorize African Americans. And so, frankly, many of them are fleeing for their lives, thinking that they will be lynched if they remain in the South. And what a horrible place for, to raise a family. So many of them are leaving out of safety precautions. But there have also been advances in terms of transportation and trains and, frankly, buses at this point that allow people to travel across country much cheaper than ever before. So what you have at the beginning of the 1920s is what's called the Great Migration. And in particular, African Americans will move to major population centers in the North, both focused on the New England area with, especially New York. And we're going to see Harlem kind of rise up as kind of the epicenter of that. But also places in the Midwest like Chicago. Chicago will have a great number of African American migrants from the Deep South. And so that, when this movement of people is happening, they bring with them culture, and frankly, in many of these areas, culture that had not been seen yet, and that includes both things like literature, but also music, food, and so this is being exposed to a greater part of America for the first time, really ever, and we start to see some major changes. Now, civil rights, I always like to say that, the civil rights struggle, you cannot put a bookend on when the civil rights era really began. I mean, we can look at the modern era in the 1950s, but civil rights has frankly been a struggle in this country since the very first African was brought over as a slave. And it'll continue to be a struggle forever, frankly. In the 1920s, there are some gains that are made. We talked earlier about, the ideas of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. It's in the 1920s that Du Bois actually forms the NAACP, which is still a very strong organization today, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, and that became kind of a legal organization where people could actually sue when their rights were being violated, and they could use lawyers from the NAACP, and again, still very active today. One civil rights leader that I did not mention in our Reform Era unit was Marcus Garvey, and frankly, he had a lot of different ideas on how to promote African Americans in America and try to improve their lot in life. Some of his early ideas actually, frankly, just included actually trying to recolonize parts of Africa, trying to move back to Africa. But obviously that idea was very expensive, logistically very difficult to do. And so instead he formed an organization called the Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA. And that association really focused on trying to build up African American communities by, promoting businesses, black-owned businesses, and trying to get people to basically keep the money in those communities. So an important step towards economic equality. And then the Harlem Renaissance. I've mentioned this a couple times, but as people are moving around, they're bringing with them their especially musical culture, and so we're going to see that emerge, and a couple major figures emerge from that movement. Excuse me. Claude McKay will become. He's a poet, a very well-known poet. That frankly was very militant in terms of showing some of the anger behind the prejudice of the time. We often so lightly talk about segregation, but this was a horrible time for people, and racism is extremely prevalent at this time, and so those frustrations build up in these communities, and Claude McKay put a voice to that, and a lot of people that resonated with them. Langston Hughes, another Missouri artist here, he was a writer, another poet who wrote a lot about his own background, coming from a working class family. And Langston Hughes was very notable because for a lot of white readers of his works, they recognized how many similarities they actually had with Mr. Hughes. regardless of race, a lot of people are struggling economically, and especially that working class, at times of economic downturn, they're struggling to put food on the table. And I think for a lot of white readers, they read these struggles that Hughes had as growing up, and they were able to, it brought them closer together, understanding that just because we may be different races, we still have a lot of the same problems. So Langston Hughes, very influential writer at the time. Two of my favorite here, you got, of course, the music, just a major part of the Harlem Renaissance. Louis Armstrong, perhaps maybe the most famous jazz musician of the age, of course, with his blown out cheeks on his trumpet. Duke Ellington and his band became one of the more famous musicians of the time. And so, there are a lot of musicians that we could talk about that would be a part of this later on, like one of my favorites, Charlie Parker, a little bit later on in time period. But still, these guys are putting jazz on the map. I mean, jazz was not a nationwide phenomenon until these guys really were broadcasting their music on the radio for all to hear, and people loved it. I mean, nobody had heard that kind of energy in music before, and obviously it takes the nation by storm, and it changes our culture forever. And finally, to wrap it up, one of the more interesting stories, I think, that I've ever come across is the story of Josephine Baker. And she was a blues singer from America that actually later in her life, she would move to Europe to tour there, to sing in concerts, and mainly escaping some racism here in the United States. But she happened to be in Europe during World War II and in France when it fell to the Nazis. She actually worked with the French underground to supply information to them. And that was the French resistance that was fighting against Nazi occupation. And she actually, continued performing, but actually was feeding information, kind of working for the French resistance during that time. It's a fascinating woman that played an integral role in world history there. I believe that is it, guys. That is it for me. I hope you enjoyed this final lecture, and congratulations on finally wrapping up the semester. I am always available via email. I'm happy to get back to you with whatever questions you may have. And thank you so much for paying attention, and hope you have a great finals period, and I'll talk to you later.